It's day 33 of the partial shutdown, and two plans to reopen the government head to the Senate with little chance of passing.
This is something President.
Thank you very much.
Why White House press briefings have practically become non-existent, and how school choice could shape the future of education. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The fate of this year's State of the Union is not looking good, and that is an understatement.
That's
Welcome
right.
to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
And I'm John Jessup. Well, it's been back and forth between President Trump and Nancy Pelosi today, all surrounding if the State of the Union speech will take place next week.
For more, we turn now to Ben Kennedy at the White House. Ben?
Well, John and Jenna, President Trump said moments ago that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has canceled the State of the Union. As John was talking about, it's been a bit of a back and forth throughout the day. First, Trump sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi saying, despite your recommendation to push back the speech, I've decided to give it a green light. In fact, on Tuesday, he reached out to the Sergeant at Arms to make sure things were clear and good to go for the speech. A reporter asked Speaker Pelosi today, what if Trump does in fact show up on 129? What will you do? Well, the speaker said he'll have to talk outside as I'm not opening the House chambers. Well, today she did reject Trump's letter. And moments ago, the commander-in-chief did give a response. Take a listen.
I'm not surprised. It's really a shame what's happening with the Democrats. They've become radicalized. They don't want to see crime stop, which we can very easily do on the southern border. And it really is a shame what's happening with the Democrats. This will go on for a while. Ultimately, the American people will have their way.
And President Trump adds that Speaker Pelosi doesn't want the American public to hear what's going on and that she's afraid of the truth. So the big question now is what's next for the State of the Union address? Well, President Trump says they are exploring alternative options and that he will, of course, keep us posted. But I'm sure that once both sides eventually get together, come together for some sort of a compromise, hash out a deal, and the government is back open, I would assume the speech will, in fact, eventually move forward. John, Jenna?
All right, Ben Kennedy for us at the White House. Thank you very much. Of course, all of this stems from the fight over funding of the government.
That's right, and Abigail Robertson joins us now from Capitol Hill. Abigail, the Senate has two measures it's looking at to end the partial shutdown, but I understand neither has much of a chance of passing.
Yes. Well, John, the two bills really reflect the issue at the heart of this matter. Democrats want a bill that reopens the government before they negotiate on border security and border funding. And Republicans insist that any bill to reopen the government must include money for the border barrier that the president wants.
First and foremost, the legislation would end this partial shutdown.
The majority leader pitched a renewed Senate bill that would reopen the government and provide temporary protections for around 1 million immigrants. But it includes one snag.
And yes, additional funding for physical barriers like the walls and fences.
That sticking point remains too high of a barrier for Democrats to overcome. At least not before the government is reopened.
There is serious and justified concern that this president would shut down the government anytime he does not get his way legislatively. That is why we must hold the line.
We should vote to open government until February 8th.
Virginia Democrat Tim Kaine said if the Senate passed an alternate bill to reopen the government for 15 days, it would provide room to negotiate.
Try to make the bill as strong as it can be, as bipartisan as it can be, because it would need to be to have a realistic chance of passing in the House.
Federal workers set to miss a second monthly paycheck on Friday are tired of waiting.
It doesn't come anywhere close to offsetting the salary that we're missing.
John Manley is an air traffic controller and father of 7 who has taken to driving for Uber on his days off. He joins others, including FBI agents and service members, looking for other work to put food on the table.
I find it unacceptable that Coast Guard men and women have to rely on food pantries and donations to get through day-to-day life as service members.
Now, the Democrats' temporary spending bill is set for a vote in the Senate tomorrow. But even if it were to pass the Senate and then the House, without funding for the border wall, it is very unlikely the president would sign this.
Now, Abigail, both sides are holding firm. As we approach day 34 of the partial government shutdown, it appears there are some cracks that are starting to form among members of both parties.
That's right, John. There's a group of moderate House Democrats that are urging Speaker Pelosi to offer President Trump a vote on funding for the border wall if he agrees to reopen the government. Now, Pelosi and Schumer have said that they do not want to negotiate until the government is reopened. And you might remember a few weeks ago when Pelosi was at the White House and President Trump floated the idea of reopening the government if she would agree to funding the border wall in a few weeks. And she said no, she does not want to give even $1 towards President Trump's border wall. So while we are seeing a growing amount of lawmakers very frustrated with this situation, hoping to see a compromise, the shutdown stalemate really won't end until leadership comes together and finds some kind of solution for the American people.
Abigail, we've seen some of these furloughed workers, turning to food banks and taking donations. Talk about how the church community is really helping is stepping up and really helping.
Yeah, here's some good news in all of this. We're seeing a few churches around the D.C. and surrounding area step up to help the furloughed workers in their congregation. And even if they're not in their congregation, we visited First Baptist Church of Glen Arden this afternoon, where they have given out 2,500 bags of groceries over the past 3 days to federal employees who are not receiving their paycheck. And here's a look at the reaction when some of those employees go through.
I would say in the midst of this, God promised peace that surpassed understanding. And there's a lot of people who don't understand where next meal, where next paycheck is coming from. So in the middle of it, just praying for peace and provision, because we get a chance to be at least a hand of that provision, and we've been praying along with people here. But the biggest thing is just so people can get what they need. And I feel like those two biggest needs, along with their paycheck, is peace and is provision.
And tomorrow we're going to speak with National Community Church here in D.C. that has set up an online fund for furloughed workers that anyone around the country can give to, that will give gift cards to federal employees that aren't receiving their paycheck. So stay tuned for more information on that.
It's great to see the churches step up and help. Abigail Robertson on Capitol Hill, thank you so much.
Well, President Trump says he told his White House press secretary not to bother with press briefings. The traditional daily updates have been lacking under the Trump administration. It's now been 36 days since the last time Sarah Sanders took the podium. That is the longest period of time the country has gone without a presidential briefing since President Trump took office. The last official White House press briefing was on December 18th.
Well, for more on not only press briefings, but also the media's access to the president, we now turn to someone who's no stranger to the briefing room, Chief Political Analyst David Brody. David, give us some perspective here. True, there are fewer press briefings, but that really doesn't account for the accessibility of the occupant of the Oval Office.
That's right. He really is, John and Jenna, on his way to becoming the most accessible president ever. Right now, Ronald Reagan holds that mantle. Give it a couple years. Donald Trump is on his way. The briefing room, another matter, obviously. And, this is a president who's not just commander-in-chief, he is communicator-in-chief. And he's not a big fan of protocol, as folks in the White House press briefing room are finding out. We added in the crickets, but this is a real look at the White House press briefing room, where there hasn't been a press conference for over a month. The White House Correspondents Association issued this statement, quote, "This retreat from transparency and accountability sets a terrible precedent." But the president declared in a tweet that, quote, "The reason Sarah Sanders does not go to the podium much anymore is that the press covers her so rudely and inaccurately. In particular, certain members of the press. I told her not to bother. The word gets out anyway." That seems to be a nod towards Jim Acosta, the reporter in the middle of all those lawsuits between the White House and CNN. And of course, that contentious press conference from a little while back. Of course, Jim Acosta will go to Twitter like he normally does, and he did it again. And he basically said to Sarah Sanders, "You haven't had a press conference, a press briefing, since the shutdown began. In a tweet, Acosta said, quote, Sanders has not taken one question from the podium about a shutdown. We have to catch her in the driveway after her hits on Fox. Well, the press secretary fired back during one of those Fox hits. Take a listen to this.
We're in the business of getting information to the American people, not making stars out of people that want to become contributors on CNN.
All right, so let's go ahead and compare the number of White House briefings in this administration compared to a previous administration, as in the Obama administration. During the same time period, between the start of her tenure and late 2018, about 18 months or so, Sanders held 6 fewer press briefings per month than President Obama's press secretary, Josh Earnest. But you have to remember Twitter comes into play here. President Trump on Twitter all of the time making his views known. In addition to that, let's remember that President Trump is not afraid to take questions. As a matter of fact, they've been tracking statistics since Reagan, and it turns out that other than President Clinton, Donald Trump has the most exchanges with the press. Just look at the nonpartisan study done by Martha Kumar, director of the White House Transition Project, Towson University, because when they add up interviews and short question and answer sessions, President Trump has held 372 exchanges, and that beats President Obama with 308 and President George W. Bush at 318. So while the press makes a big stink about not hearing from the press secretary, they really can't say that they haven't heard from the man in charge. As a matter of fact, the media critic from the Washington Post, not necessarily a conservative organization if you know what I mean, says Trump is extremely accessible. So the question really becomes, why all the fuss in the media? Well, when Sanders appeared on Faith Nation more than a year ago, she had a theory.
You know, I've never seen the level of hostility that we have with today's mainstream media. I've been in politics a long time, and even a pretty hostile media when my dad first took office in Arkansas, but it pales in comparison to the day in, day out attacks that are taking place on this president. And this is a president who loves to talk directly to the American people. It's one of the reasons I think he was elected, because he has that ability to reach out directly through those social media platforms. I think that's a positive and something that we should certainly elevate and let him have fun with from time to time.
You know, a lot of the folks who support Donald Trump say he's accomplished a lot in 2 years. Here's one thing you cannot dispute. The liberal mainstream media was always there from the get-go, but under Donald Trump, he really has exposed and outed a lot of these mainstream journalists who we never thought were quite that liberal or that leftist before or that agenda-driven before. But indeed, I think we've seen quite a bit of that in the first 2 years of the Trump administration.
Yeah, David, what's your take? What's your sense? Is there a real danger here with the lack of press briefings, and especially as it relates to trust between the president and the American people?
Well, I think all of us as journalists should just for sure go on the record and say the more briefings, the better. I don't think there's any question about that. Having said that, look, Donald Trump has opened up, we call these the pool sprays, right? You know, where a pool camera, in other words, one network reporter and a cameraman go in, and all of a sudden it becomes for an hour and a half meeting. So that's a lot of transparency right there. What about Chuck and Nancy and what happened there when Trump actually worked against them there, where he said, I'd be proud to shut down the government. So, I mean, if we weren't getting briefings, but we were actually not even getting anything from Trump himself, that'd be one thing. But boy, he's been very, very accessible.
Yeah, very accessible, and yeah, we'll see if the State of the Union also happens.
Yeah, I'll be around for that.
You know, either way, I think we'll hear from him.
I think that's a good bet. I'm going to take that bet.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Yep.
All right. Well, the Trump White House is putting forward more conservative judges.
That's right. This week, it renominated 51 federal judicial nominees left over from the previous Congress, but getting them confirmed may take some time. Republicans accuse Democrats of slow-walking these nominees, taking the unusual step of using the full 30 hours allotted to debate each one. Right now, there are more than 160 judicial vacancies in the federal court system, which is more than there were when President Trump took office 2 years ago.
Well, the Judicial Crisis Network is getting ready to launch a major ad campaign to put pressure on these Democrats. Carrie Severino with the JCN joins us now. Carrie, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Hey, Carrie, tell us about this $1.5 million ad campaign.
Well, we're excited to see these renominations, and we've been thrilled to see the efforts the Trump administration and Leader McConnell in the Senate have made to get great judges confirmed, record numbers of circuit judges in particular being confirmed. But the pushback we've had from the Democrats, the procedural gimmicks they've used to slow judges down, have resulted in skyrocketing numbers of vacancies. And then we're seeing a really disturbing trend now of bullying nominees, even unconstitutional religious tests kind of being thrown around. Very disappointing. So our ad is wanting to highlight that, saying, hey, look, this has been one of the really successful aspects of this administration. We need to move forward in these nominees, and we have to make sure we are standing up against these bullies.
Yeah, Carrie, Senate Republicans are discussing the nuclear option, which would eliminate the filibuster and significantly cut down that debate time. Do you think that that is the right play here?
Well, actually, the Democrats have already eliminated the filibuster itself for these judges. What they're now doing is they're trying to use procedural hooks to just add extra time. And we're talking this, it's up to 30 hours per judge. It's not even time they use to talk about the judge themselves. Very rarely are the judges even mentioned during that time. It's just an effort to run out the clock. These are judges who used to be confirmed with a voice vote in package deals, so it would take literally moments and you'd get a bunch of judges confirmed at once. Now they're trying to drag it out so each judge takes days and days and wastes Senate time. This is not a good move. It's not good for our country. It's a waste of time for the Senate. I think it may be at the point where we have to just change the rules to limit that debate time. It's something that was done during the Obama administration as well. That was a bipartisan agreement at that time. Unfortunately, maybe the era of bipartisanship is behind us, and we need to at this point just say if you have to just do it with 51 votes, we're going to limit some of the ability to waste Americans' time and those procedural gimmicks and move forward on some of these great judges.
Carrie, bring this home for everybody sitting at home. If these seats do continue to remain vacant, what does this mean for the average American? What are the repercussions?
Well, anyone who's trying to get their case heard in court, you have a slower and slower process. But let's not forget what the end game is. The reason the Democrats are trying to slow these judges down is because they know one of their ways to accomplish the things they're not able to do at the ballot box, that they don't have public support for, is to do it through the back door with getting judges who are going to behave more like politicians than like judges just enforcing the law. The nominees that President Trump has put forward are so principled. They are committed to following the Constitution as it's written, following the text of the laws as they're passed. That's something we should all be able to get behind. It's only a threat when you're someone coming from the left who's used to using those judges to get around the words of the Constitution or the law. So what the real goal is here, they'd like to just stop Trump from being able to put these incredibly principled and qualified men and women on the court. And I think that's why they're just pulling out all the stops. It's not just the procedure, it's this really, as I said, bullying. It's people using smear campaigns. It's people saying, well, if you are a Christian, if you're a member of, for example, the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization, you're not fit for the bench. And that's something that is very worrisome, is profoundly un-American, to say that there should be a religious test and people of, the Christian faith should not be eligible for judicial offices.
Yeah, deeply concerning to so many Americans. All right, Carrie Severino, thank you so much. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Well, a faith-based foster care program has been granted a request to help protect its religious liberty. Today, the Administration for Children and Families, a branch of the Department of Health and Human Services, announced South Carolina-based Miracle Hill Ministries can continue to select foster parents who align with their religious beliefs. Now, some have criticized the requirement as discriminatory against people of different faith backgrounds, though many hail today's announcement as a win for faith-based groups. Some, like Southern Baptist leaders Russell Moore, spoke out about the foster kids at the heart of the debate, tweeting, "We can have our culture arguments, but not at the expense of vulnerable children who need loving homes."
How the Trump administration is reshaping the future of the judiciary. That story when we come back. The young man at the center of a viral video that ignited a nationwide debate is speaking out. The video appeared to show a group of students, many of them wearing Make America Great Again hats, surrounding a Native American group at the Lincoln Memorial. But another longer video shows the students being harassed by a third party. 16-year-old Nick Sandman told NBC News he was trying to calm things down.
As far as standing there, I had every right to do so. My position is that I was not disrespectful to Mr. Phillips. I respect him. I'd like to talk to him. I mean, in hindsight, I wish we could have walked away and avoided the whole thing.
And joining me now is Scott Whitlock, Associate Editor at the Media Research Center's Newsbuster. Scott, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, Scott, you saw clips from the Today Show interview with the Covington Catholic High School teen. What's your response to the coverage?
Well, I think it's an outgrowth of the original coverage, which was originally they jumped to conclusions because they wanted this to be true. And then we saw a bit of a backpedaling over the weekend as it appeared that it wasn't. So, but on NBC, the Today Show and the Nightly News, they were still trying to put some kind of culpability onto these kids and kind of saying, well, you know, what did they do to provoke this, or what was their role in this? And it seems like a lot of these journalists simply don't want to admit that they were wrong in this case.
Scott, there's been a lot of talk about the media blunders overall in this coverage. Newsbusters has labeled the coverage as disgusting and shameful. What is it exactly that you find most alarming? Is it the rush to judgment? Is it not correcting the record, or is it something else?
I'd say it's a combination because, yeah, it's certainly the rush to judgment, and we've seen that over and over again, specifically during the Trump presidency. But when they want something to be true, they don't bother to check it. We saw that last Friday with the BuzzFeed story, and I think these two stories are very similar. And then after this happened, after it became apparent that the initial story was wrong, we didn't really get apologies. What we got was essentially saying that this story is more complicated, more nuanced. That was a word they used a lot than they originally said, not we were wrong.
Not a full-blown apology or full-blown correction. We don't yet know who's behind the fake account who posted that initial partial viral video. Some suggest it could be political operatives like we saw in the 2017 Alabama special election. Interestingly, today on the 700 Club, CBN CEO commented how foreign actors aim to use social media to drive Americans further apart on everything from politics to race and guns and even vaccines back in the 2016 election. Who do you think is behind all of this and why?
Well, that's the thing. We don't know, and it could be anyone. I will say that what we've seen with Twitter is journalists are supposed to have editors. If you're in the TV business or in the newspaper business, you have an editor. And we have these same journalists. They have no editor on Twitter. So there's no one who's going to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't jump and assume this is the way it initially seems to be. So we don't know who was behind it, but I have a real problem with these journalists who, with no sort of fact-checking or real evidence, assume the worst. They assume these kids wearing MAGA hats were guilty, and that's just wrong. That's not how journalism should be done.
Scott, we have just a little under a minute left. As you know, the president has called these students victims of fake news. He's extended an invitation to the students after the school was forced to close due to threats and protests. What about coverage now that the president has waded into the situation?
Well, anytime the president weighs in, they kind of assume bad motivation for him. So we haven't necessarily seen that yet, but there has been accusations from the press that the president is kind of making this political, as if that wasn't already done from the beginning by these same journalists.
Scott Whitlock with Newsbusters, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Welcome back. Well, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says he's breaking off relations with the United States, and U.S. diplomats have 72 hours to get out of his country.
That came after the leader of the opposition-controlled Congress, Juan Guaido, declared himself interim president and called for elections. President Trump immediately backed Guaido.
Well, as far as any possible U.S. military action, President Trump says the U.S. isn't considering anything specific, but, quote, all options are on the table. The Trump administration has imposed several rounds of sanctions on Venezuela over the last 2 years, trying to pressure the government to restore democracy. Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation.
Have a great evening.